this afternoon. Ha, no one got my thank you on recording. So thank you again. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all, and then we're going to get started from there. All right, so I hopefully you all can see the screen and you can still see myself and Kayla. So as you know, the presentation today is in regards to working with the dying as a counselor or as a doula. Your presenters today are Kayla De La Rosa, and I'm going to allow Kayla to introduce herself.
Hi everyone. I went to Westchester University and studied sociology, and I basically found my passion through counseling through a homework assignment that involved me to look at children in the schooling, and I realized that I wanted to care about them and care for them and listen to them and not really teach them like subject things. But that's pretty much how I landed here.
Thanks, Kayla. And as for myself, I'm a faculty member in the CMHC program at Commonwealth U Lock Haven campus, and you can see my credentials there on the screen. So, as you already know, our presentation is focused on working with a dying person and their family. One of the reasons that I became passionate with this, I've always thought about end of life and what that looks like. And some of you who know me a little better than others know that I spent a period of time in 22 and 23 caring, being the primary caregiver for my father, who was the end of his life. And after he died, I thought more and more about this. And so I took a look at the difference, what's the difference between myself as a counselor and working with the dying person. So that's where our focus came from for Kayla and myself today, looking at counselors and doulas as we work with the dying person in their community and noticing the similarities as well as the differences. And we'd like to really have a conversation with you at the end about culture, intersectionality, and normalizing our work with a dying person. So our learning objectives for today are, we hope that you'll be able to understand a little bit more about the role of an end-of-life doula, that you can see the differences between counseling work and doula work with a dying person, and to really think about cultural humility and intersectionality and the impact on dying and death.
There are a lot of misconceptions when talking about end of life care. A common misconception is that end of life care means giving up. End of life care doesn't mean giving up, it's about being comfortable and having that support. Another misconception is that the end of life care is only for the dying, which is not true. It's also for the family. Some might think that the end of life care means isolation, when in reality, they're often making very meaningful relationships with healthcare providers, families, and friends. It's also thought that it's only about the physical problems, but the physical problems are getting taken care of. There are emotional and psychological needs as well.
So when we think about being an end-of-life doula, I'm sure most of you have heard about a birth doula, right? The movement that began in the US in about the 70s and working with pregnant women as they were birthing their child. This is also where the roots of end-of-life doula can be found. Continuum Hospice in New York City was actually the first organization that used the end-of-life doula approach. It was created by Henry Frisco Weiss, who's also the co-founder of the International End-of-Life Doula Association, which is actually where I got my training. Working as an end-of-life doula, which some people also might call a death doula, it addresses the planning, dying, and grieving. The doula focuses on holding this space for the dying person, helping them and their family normalize grief. And as a doula, we have to withhold judgment. One of the key tenets when I went through the training was leaving myself at the door. So when I walked in to work with a family and with their dying person, to withhold judgment, to leave my stuff at the door before walking in. Time that we spend with a dying person and their family is providing emotional, logistical, and spiritual support to the dying person and their family. One of the most important takeaways for me, especially having my formalized training as a counselor, was wait, why am I talking? Which is very different from being a counselor, right? When working as a doula, really thinking about why am I spending so much time talking? It's about the person who's dying. And so, really looking at their beliefs, their customs, their traditions, we need to remember that every culture has their own traditions and rituals related to dying, as well as the aftercare for the body and soul. So, as an end of life doula, I'm there to support and help the person have what we like to call a good death. So, similarities between counseling and doula work are things like both might tend to use guided imagery, music and reading for folks. Those of you who are working in the counseling field understand, you know, the strength and the power behind using music, reading, bibliotherapy. We teach from the very beginning the basic skills, using open-ended questions, very similar to doula work. Clarifying statements and questions, getting as much information as possible. That all encompassing allowing for silence, right? Making sure that we're not spending more time talking, but allowing for the silence and the thought processing. Reading the individual's nonverbals and helping them to identify emotions is very similar in both cases. Other things, the counselor as well as the doula is in a supportive role. So we try to provide emotional and psychological support. We involve the family, often work with the family of the member of the dying, if possible. If they're present, sometimes we may find that they're not involved for whatever reason, and we have to value that. We have to, adhere to the dying person's requests when it involves the family. And really holistic approach, considering their physical, emotional, and spiritual needs, thinking about their interactions with the medical community, and making sure that we're not overstepping our bounds in either the counselor or the doula rules. Differences that we saw when working on our presentation, the counselor is really using a lot of reflective listening, thinking about resolution and helping the person move forward, really thinking of, and when we talk about basic skills even or advanced skills, looking at goals and objectives, helping the person move forward and working on specific things. With a doula, it's not really about that. It's deep active listening, really focusing on what that person is sharing and talking about, learning as much as we possibly can, helping them reprocess. Is there anything that they would like to talk about? Things that have happened, things that, maybe they're thinking about unresolved things, and just allowing them the space to talk about that. Not so much of helping them get to resolution, right? But more about just sharing and talking through things. We use gentle, soothing touch. So if a person is, if you think about the difference between a counselor and a doula, there's a lot to be said for the touch and the being in the here and now with that individual. We don't talk as much about, physical touch in the counselor role, but in the doula role, we do. It could be massage, it could be helping the dying person with lotions or um, anything like that, that would help them become more relaxed, more comfortable. Um, we do a lot of structured life review. So talking to the person about, if it's important to them, thinking about things that they've gone through, and the memories and all of those pieces that come from thinking back on their life. A lot of times we'll find that a person who's in the dying process, is really thinking about, um, what have I done in my life? What did I wish I would have done? But really looking at their focus and thinking about moment to moment, what are the things that matter the most to them? Oops. Other differences, a counselor may be involved at any stage of the dying process, but they really focus a little bit more on the psychological aspects of coping. And they tend to work in a facility, right? A clinical setting, a mental health facility, could be a nursing home, or a hospital setting. But with a doula, we really tend to be involved from the point where the person has called us. And that could be as early as the time of diagnosis, through the dying process, and even after death, working with the family or the caregivers, the loved ones. And a lot of times, doulas find themselves being called into the house, into the home of the person who's dying, or the caregiver's home, in a hospice setting, in a hospital setting. So, a lot of variety in regards to the setting that we're in, as opposed to a counselor. So Kayla's going
Another
to talk about,
sorry.
sorry, I was just going to say, Kayla's going to talk about cultural considerations.
Another aspect that we need to keep in mind is the person's cultural background. It's important that we are aware of one's beliefs and values. Quality communication is also important. You have to be open and ask questions. It's important to also keep an open mind to support culturally sensitive alternatives that are different from our own. You're also making sure that you're not pushing your own attitudes, beliefs, and values, and you're being attentive to intersecting identities. There are many differences when it comes to culture. For example, in Asian cultures, it's common for family members to make decisions on behalf of elderly relatives. In some cultures, it can be considered inappropriate to discuss a terminal diagnosis directly to the patient. This is believed to cause distress to the patient. Throughout the world, the total age expectancy varies aside from location, race, and gender. For example, it's much higher mortality rate for Black women and men. There are also cultural differences from United States and other countries. In the United States, the elderly tend to be put in a nursing home. Patient autonomy is emphasized in the US. This is rooted from the belief that patients should have control over their own bodies and medical treatments, making sure that their personal values are being met. End-of-life care can include working with an end-of-life counselor or doula. Whereas compared to like other countries, in some African and Native American cultures, elders are held at a high status, often cared for in home by families. In parts of Latin America, physician authority is more widespread. This is due to cultural norms that emphasize trust in medical professionals. And then in the Jewish culture, end-of-life care usually consists of the presence of a rabbi. There are also a lot of cultural funeral differences when you compare the United States to other countries. In the US, funerals tend to be more reserved. People tend to mourn more quietly. Men are also taught at an early age not to show emotion, so grieving may be harder for them. Men are typically taught to be strong and have it all together. Traditional funerals tend to have a wake or a viewing service in either burial or cremation, and the ashes are typically kept in an urn or they're scattered or they're buried. Then, when you look at other countries, for example, in Portugal, it's normal for the men to scream out and sob. And then in Novena, there is a 9-day period of prayer following death. This is a time for family and friends to come over and pray, seek comfort and guidance. In Ghana, it's known to have a colorful coffin to represent the deceased life. During Hindu funerals, the eldest son or close male relative perform the rituals, and then the ashes are typically spread in a river. In Mexico, families honor their love, they honor their deceased loved ones with a celebration, which is Dia de los Muertos. And on Dia de los Muertos, they usually have like an altar with photos, fruits, vegetables, candles, just things that represented that deceased one. And next, we're going to be talking about intersectionality.
Thanks, Kayla. So when we consider culture, we all know that death is universal, right? We all, at some point in life, are going to die. As Kayla discussed, there's differences in the way that we commemorate death and how we think about it and how we acknowledge it. If we use intersectionality as a tool to move beyond culture, race, class, and also consider social inequality and various interactions of privilege and oppression, we can hopefully better assist the dying person and their family. Um, so if you look at the image on the screen, which I really can appreciate it. It was shared with us in our NELDA training. You'll notice that on the, there's privilege as well as oppression, right? So while I might find myself privileged in that I'm educated and I'm a white person, I might find myself in the bottom where, under oppression, where I'm a female. I sorry, I'm going to consider myself old. Um, but those sorts of, I'm in my second half of my life, we'll put it that way. But those are certain things to really think about when we're working with folks is, where do they fall and how do these things all interact for them? And so if we think about intersectionality, we really need to think about, for example, a person's access to quality health care and end of life. So finding support services and supportive environments for someone, for example, if we look at racial and ethnic backgrounds, it helps influence how they cope and find sensitive, supportive groups. One of the things that I always think about is, for example, someone who's in the LGBTQIA plus group, making sure that they are able to, when they lose a partner or a spouse, that they have the option, that they have a space to go to that's comfortable, that's safe to have the conversation about the loss of their loved one. Um, Gender roles play a part. And, Kayla talked about that a little bit when she talked about the age-old males aren't supposed to cry or aren't supposed to show sadness when they lose someone. Those are very challenging things. Those are expectations that we place on other people. Cultural beliefs also play that role, and seeing the intersectionality. So, what is my culture and my gender and my educated or uneducated age, all of those things really play a part. So it's important for us to see, again, the whole person when we're working with someone who's dying, not just their physical attributes, but where they come from and what they're bringing with them, and finding out those things, not just making assumptions, but being able to ask those questions and learn about them as we're working with them, regardless of our role, whether it's as a counselor or as a doula.
Last but not least is new perspectives. You want to make sure that you have an open mind and are open to understanding and seeing other people's perspectives. We can learn new perspectives and ideas from learning about different cultures. We also must understand that two people from the same cultural background will not grieve the same. People can't stop the body from dying, but there are ways they can tolerate it. They can do things like finding support and comfort during that time. Overall, the key is to find purpose throughout life, and you can do this through different meanings even when facing death. And now we have a few questions for you to think about. Have you thought about if you would want to see an end of life counselor or doula? If so, why or why not? What sort of things and scene would you want as you're passing if you had the choice? In what ways do you think talking about death can influence how we live our lives? How do you think people can best cope with the fear of death? And how do your own personal beliefs shape your view on death?
Dr. Riley and Kayla, can I the Josh Moyer here? Can I ask you a question about if there's a high level the difference between a death doula and hospice, and if
Mhm.
there's any sort of intersectionality between the two?
So, Josh, I'm going to answer your question. A death doula is a non-medical person. So, as a doula, I wouldn't administer medication. I wouldn't have anything to do with that. I would bring the hospice person into that because they're going to. And in regards to hospice, it's maintenance for them, right? It's not like we're going to try and make them feel better. It's making them comfortable. So the administration of medication and anything that has to do with their medical health would be a hospice related issue.
So you would go in alongside hospice. You would go
Yes.
in, right?
Well, I say yes, but there are exceptions. There are times when a doula might work with a person by themselves, so they don't have hospice involved for whatever reason. Um, but they're just at the point where, they for themselves, they've decided that this is what they want to do. And one of the interesting things that I found in my training was that our trainer actually had been called in like 2 days before the person was done had actually died. So she didn't do a whole lot of work with the individual, but the family thought it would be really helpful for someone to come and be there with their loved one if they couldn't be there, or just to see if there were things that the doula could assist with during the process of dying. And a lot of times it depends on the family, but a doula may be present when the person actually dies, to comfort the family during the process if there is if they're in the home. Does that answer your question?
It does. It
Okay.
does. Mm-hmm.
Other questions that folks have or thoughts about the discussion questions that we have that Kayla has shared with you? Bob, go ahead.
I I'm wondering how often as a doula you end up working with your client's family after they die. Is that something that you would see often?
Based on my limited experience, it is, especially depending on the dynamics of the family, which is something you'd expect. But yeah, there are cases where the families, like, some families might even say, we don't want you present when they die. We don't want you here when our
Hmm.
mother dies or whatever. Or we really want you here to help us get through this process
Hmm.
and to reprocess, right? Whether it's the next day, the next week, in the next few months, things that had happened. One of the things that doulas do work with that I didn't talk about is plans, right?
Hmm.
So what what is the person's plan for what do I want done with my body after I've died? Um, and so the doula can work with the family on that. And it's interesting because it's redirection of, so let's say the person has died and they're like, I want my ashes spread. I'm just making this up, at Mount Rushmore. And the family's like, no, we're going to keep her ashes and we want them. The doula would gently remind the family that, well, remember when your mother was in the last stages, this is what she wanted to do, and it's really important that we can honor her legacy by following through with these things.
Hmm.
Ultimately, the family's going to do what they're going to do, but
Yep.
yeah, I would have to say I don't have a number on it, but in a lot of cases, the doula does continue just to help the family with the process after death if the person was able to make that plan.
Yeah. Well, I was seeing a little bit like a trauma bond,
Mhm.
where the you're there at this family's, often greatest time of need.
Right.
And like let's say it's a good connection. It probably happens pretty quick if it is a good one. Them wanting to seek, let's say, grief counseling or adjustment, what have you, after the fact. A couple weeks, couple months after the fact. Is that something that a doula would continue on doing? Because like then it's into like counseling as
Right.
opposed to doula.
Right. And that's one of the things myself and some of the folks that I went through the training with were also social workers. And that was one of the things that we spent some time talking about was seeing the difference. So I'm called in as a doula. I might be an LPC, but I'm called in as a doula. So if there's grief counseling, I would refer the family to
Okay.
providers and resources. And that's the other thing is knowing what the resources are in the area so that we can refer the family. I personally would see it as a conflict of interest to say, oh, and I'll see you for death counseling or grief counseling
Yeah.
too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Good. Okay. That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're
I
right.
just
Very
want
well.
to thank you both for that conversation. My question was really similar to Bob's and where that differentiation exists and what is ethical given, um, like he said, it's this pivotal time in their life. So thank you.
Yeah, and Christy, I will say, when I started my training, myself and a couple of the social workers were really like, this is a shift for us, right? This is like really, and I couldn't be more thoughtful about at the door. I'm not a counselor. I'm not an LPC. I'm a doula here to sit with you, make you comfortable, and it's all about you, right? No, and as counselors, we talk about self-disclosure. That doesn't come into play here. It's about the person there. I can talk to them, but I should always be turning it back over to them.
Thank you. And as you described the process with the family, it sounded like process, almost like continuing the contract that the family had come up with versus the emotional caregiving for the family. So that helped me. Thanks.
Sure, no problem. Julie.
Yes, Lisa, this is amazing work. And so my question kind of ties into the last question on this slide with the
Mm.
kind of personal elements of doing this kind of work. The topic of death is one that a lot of people don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. So, I guess my question is, this is hard work that you're
Mhm.
doing, that the people that are doing this work. Does it become easier the more you do it? Like being a doula, working with people who are end of life, actively dying, does that process over time become easier personally on the folks that do it?
Based on my training and my exposure to the folks that I've been working with, no. Um, and I know from personal experience, and Julie, I think you can probably relate. Um, it's different. And my personal experience definitely comes into play. I think one of the really key things for me, that really pushed me, okay, I thought about dual work for a long time, and it really pushed me was, I think about folks primarily in nursing homes, right? If you've ever had a family member in a nursing home and you go visit, inevitably you're going to pass the doorway of several folks who are just there. There's no one with them. You don't know because it's not shared with you. But I always thought about like how sad, how I would never, I think about my end of life. I would not want to be alone at that point in my life, right? I would want someone there. And I think that's, for folks who don't have family, don't have any, I think about when my grandmother was 80 and she was like, all my friends are dead. And then she'd laugh about it. But if you're lucky enough to live long, you do lose family members and colleagues and friends. And so thinking about the good death, being able to provide that for someone, the comfort of just being there for them. And we don't talk about death, which is really sad to me. And normalize the fact that, we don't get out of here alive, right? And it sounds kind of morbid to say that, but it's a true statement. And so I just think being there and being some comfort, but I don't know that it gets easier. And I know, the woman who did my training has worked in hospice, worked as a hospice nurse, has spent years doing the work, and each situation is different. But she said, it doesn't get easier because the end result is you lose your client. You lose that person, that whatever that attachment is that you've formed with them. And as we stress, as all of us here as counselors or counselor educators, that self-care piece is so vital, right? Because when you're doing counseling, when you're doing work as an LPC or a school counselor or LCSW, our goal is to see folks do better, right? Do well, be well. That's not the work of a doula. Our work is to see them have a good death, which is so important, and has really given me a totally, totally different perspective on death of myself as well as my care, those folks that I care about. And I think one other thing, and I'm going to stop talking so folks can ask questions. One of the other things that was really helpful for me was one of our presenters had said, I make sure every day that I think about my death and what that's going to look like, because that helps me live my life fuller. And that's something I've been striving for since becoming trained. Some days I don't think about it, but really thinking about, what aspects do I want to work on? What would my death look like? And okay, so that's there. What's today going to look like?
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, the work is so important. And as you were talking, I was also being reminded that even sometimes when people have a dying person has others in their lives, for example, they have maybe children or brothers or sisters, the topic and just the concept of death can be so scary for those family members and loved ones that they avoid the situation. And I've seen that sometimes happen too, where they don't want to go to the nursing home and visit because it's depressing or it's sad. They know the outcome. So I think the work that you and others are doing is so important, because even when people do have those in their life, sometimes those people are not prepared and they don't want to come in and be with that person in those final moments and those really, really tough moments. So just kudos to you, because this is awesome work and important work.
Yeah. And I mean, I think back to, 5 or 10 years ago when my parents, they were both in their 90s when they died, and, them saying, well, we're not going to be here. And I'd be like, oh, don't say that. In my head, you're going to be here forever. And on the one hand, it makes life easier for ourselves, but it's discounting where they are, right? If we really think about it.
Sure.
And not giving them that space to be comfortable with, I am at that venture, I'm getting closer to the end of my life. And so I should be able to talk about that. And you're right, that's one of the most important things for a doula. One of the other things that's kind of challenging that we talked about in our training was having family members doing that kind of stuff in the presence of the person who's dying, or talking about them while they're there. And that we need to remember that we're an advocate for, regardless of who has brought us in, whether it's the person who's dying or a family member, our contract, so to speak, is with the dying person. And so if someone's saying, well, she wants this or he wants, they're present. One of the last senses we lose is our hearing. So they may not be speaking to you, but they are hearing what you are saying. And, the fact that we really need to be mindful of that, and speak to them, not about them. Other questions, comments, anything? Go ahead.
Mine's a strange logistical question. How does compensation work? Is this insurance or what is this?
There is no insurance, um, unfortunately. Most doulas will, and one of the things that we're given is the opportunity to learn from folks who are. So being a trained doula is not the same as being a certified doula, which neither one gets paid for through insurance. But learning from those who have, quote, come before us and how to write contracts with family or individuals in regards to what do you charge, what does it look like, um, that whole aspect. At some point, it would be great if insurance would consider this as a piece of hospice, but no.
It sounds like something to reach out to the board about.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Christy?
Thank you. Trying to do all the technology things at once. Geez. So this is a huge interest area of mine. I just want to say that working with death in general, whether it's before, after, all of it. I would like to know if you feel it's within the scope of this presentation, the difference between or the differences between serving as a doula and a chaplain.
That's a really interesting question. Um, I don't know. I guess I'm wondering what other people think because you're right. I think about because I know with my father in hospice, he had a chaplain through hospice, although if I'm being brutally honest, he was like, I don't want to talk to him. And I was like, okay, no worries. Um, so there is that option to address the spiritual piece, I would think. But I guess I'm wondering what other folks are thinking. Julie, are you raising your hand to
Yeah, I
answer?
was I was just yeah, I'll answer the question, Elisa. And so I know, when my dad was dying, we were involved with hospice and we did have a chaplain as well. And I think that person was available to really work on the spiritual and or connection to the religious piece, but really didn't do some of the, you know, end of life kind of planning and that you're describing. So I think that person, prayed with him and connected him to, the priest that wanted to come and do last rites and, those kinds of things, like managed to be that liaison to that spiritual and religious component where it sounds like what you're talking about is a little more broad. It could be spiritual and religious, but it doesn't have to be. It's really about what's important to that person, where I feel like maybe a chaplain may only be called in if, I mean, I could be wrong. This is again just based on my own experience. If there is that like spiritual slash religious component that needs tending to.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Julie. And calling in whomever the person wants to have contact with, whether it's a priest or a minister or a rabbi or, no one, to touch on that spiritual piece. And maybe, the person wants to do a lot of work or no work in that area. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Or I want to make sure we get to Josh's question or comment too.
Should I ask? Should I go ahead? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
go right
Okay.
ahead.
Great. Dr. Weaver, as a death doula, what are your thoughts on the concept of these death cafes that have been kind of popping up? Have you seen this trend?
Yes.
I've not been to one, but I've read about it in several publications. What are your thoughts on that?
There's a lot of doulas doing that. We actually have a private Facebook page and they'll pop up and it'll be like, hey, I'm having a death cafe kind of thing where I guess to me, it's if we're offering it and folks want to join in on that, I think that's a great opportunity to have these conversations. I will tell you, Josh, I have been exposed to some really interesting things that I probably wouldn't have been prior to going through the training and prior to end of life doula really, I'm going to say coming of its own, but being more heard about, right? There's certain things that we learned about when folks decide to withhold food and water. There's specific things that need to be considered, and medical folks need to be involved. Um, the death cafes, again, being offered, is that any different from a group where folks with a terminal diagnosis or a terminal, illness might go and collect conversation together and get that support? I know in the Western states, and this I found very interesting, um, was, and I learned this from another participant in my training, was she, when we were introducing ourselves, she basically said, I got my husband back yesterday, and I was like, and then she expanded on that, and it's possible now to take your loved one and have them, for lack of a better word, turned into compost. And so she brought her husband home and was, he's in the flowers, and she was very thrilled with that. I know if you would have said that to one of my parents, they would have been like, what? Never, don't do that to me. But just all these alternatives that we have that are coming up that are uncomfortable for some folks, right? That, like, who would have thought that there was a death cafe? Why would I want to go? And thank you, Jen Sinclair. A local practitioner holds death cafes, um, and folks find it helpful. If there's other things that are out there, I think that's awesome for us to take advantage of, because it's not, and again, this sounds, and I don't mean it to sound very trite, but it's not like people can come back and tell us, right? It's not like I can say to you, this is what it's going to feel like when you die. I don't know. None of us do. And every person is individual. So that fear, of what's coming at the end of my life, if we can help folks work through that, whether it's as a counselor or as a doula, and be comfortable and be okay and experience a quote good death, then I feel like we've done, a great job in helping folks. Um, but yeah, I've never been to one. I'm looking for one in my area so that I can attend, but I've never held one. I've never attended one, but I think they're very helpful for folks who take that interest.
I've not been either. Since been reading about it, I did join a couple of Facebook groups about it, and I've seen some online ones, which I'm curious about. I don't think they'd have the same impact, and I don't think we'll see them here in North Carolina anytime soon. But yeah, just curious. It's a fascinating concept to me.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Sure.
Can I just ask one other question? So how would a family or a dying person get connected to a doula? Like, would that be through, is the hospital well aware of it, nursing homes? Like a lot of times, people, that's where they end up, either, a nursing facility or a hospital in those final days, sometimes at home. But like, how often would a doula be recommended, or how would a person connect with a doula?
It's a great question, Julie. We actually have a listserv. So if you would do a Google search of end of life doula, you could come to the INELDA list. We have a list of who's certified, who's trained. You can do a search based on area. But that's how folks find us if we're not connected to a hospice. So hospice know about us. Funeral homes are another place that, I have a colleague who works directly with a funeral home, and when folks are making the arrangements, they'll provide the information, just like, in case you're interested, here it is, kind of thing. And I'm hoping, that continues to grow, because I think the more options we have for folks, who are at this point, or at some point going to get there, I think better.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I was going to say as well, while I was working on this, I started to ask like my own family questions about like death because it was always such a like sensitive topic or like touchy topic because no one really wanted to talk about it. So I asked like my parents what they wanted after they passed away, and my mom said she wanted to be cremated where my dad just wanted to be buried. And I think finding those things out would and then bring me comfort when they do pass because I would then think like this is what they wanted. So I think that has to do with that. So it is important to have those conversations because I think it would help you in the end.
So true, Kayla. And people change their mind, right? I mean, when my parents were younger, they wanted to be buried, then they wanted to be in a mausoleum, and then I was like, "You're going to take up space," and they were like, "Okay, we'll be cremated." So it really, but it's something to talk about. You're right.
And I think that brings up the cultural component as well, don't you think? That some cultures are far more open to talking about it. Number one, have a different viewpoint of it, and have less of the finality that we often think of with death. I mean, I think they, you know, but I think there's a huge cultural consideration there.
Definitely. And I have to share one of the other things that I found interesting, comforting, had a lot of perspective on it was several of the tenets that we find throughout at least the training that I went through to be trained as a doula, um, have their background, their foundation, if you will, in some Buddhist practices. So, and several of the folks who were present were trained. So that really broadened my perspective as well.
I know that we're close to time. I wanted to ask how long your training took.
It was about 26 hours. And because I couldn't go in person, and those of you who take evening classes can appreciate this, it was every Tuesday from 6:30 to 10:30 at night. And I was like, wow. But once I was there, I was like, oh my gosh, it's 10:30. Like the conversation and the wealth of knowledge, I can't even discuss. I mean, I got to meet and form relationships with folks from all around the world, a woman from Thailand, a gentleman from New Zealand. It's international. So it was really something, and I treasure all of that and enjoy continuing those conversations with them.
Dr. Weaver, can you drop the link to for us where you did do your training? Are you able to do that?
All you have to do is look up inelda.com.
Can you say that again?
INELDA.com.
Yeah, it's Inelda. It's IN here. I'll put it in
Yep.
the chat. Sorry.
Oh, I got it. Thank you.
We got
You
it.
got
Thank
it?
you.
Yes, it was, I can't say enough good things about them, but there's several different ways that you could become a trained or a certified doula. So that was just one of them that I found that suited me best. Thank you all for coming to the conversation. I hope that we can continue this in some avenue. I know Kayla and I have talked about continuing our research and doing some presentations. So thank you.
Thank you,
Yes,
everyone.